Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 11th installment of Encyclopedia Hermetica, a Big History. Today we're going to talk about Egypt. Specifically, the Egypt of our time period, which we're currently at. The 8th century, the 7th century, the 6th century. Alright, so as it's symptomatic of our interest to relate a big picture of world history, we're going to have to mess with timescales a bit and rewind to talk about what's going on specifically in Egypt. We've talked about Greece, we've talked about the Near East, especially with a focus on Israel, so let's talk about Egypt for a bit. In many scholarly and archaeological accounts concerning the Greeks and their colonies overseas, Egypt tends to get lumped in with all the other empires of the Near East in a sort of monolithic Oriental bloc. This has historic reasons. And ever since the writings of the critical theorist Edward Said in the 1960s, we've decided to blame this on a phenomenon called Orientalism, a sort of fleshed out false dichotomy, an us versus them-ism that breaks up the East and the West into a concrete polarity wherein the East is the seat of mysticism, of mystery and tyranny, while the West is the seat of reason, of enlightenment, of good old American-flavored freedom. Well, obviously, this is what the great Terence McKenna would have called an epistemological cartoon, a sort of flattening or compression of a really complex and multifaceted truth into an all-too-easy, two-dimensional picture of what's going on. I can't get into this whole subject in too much detail here, but what I will say is that whatever the relationship of the two great Near Eastern river valley civilizations, the Mesopotamian ones and the Nilotic ones, both of these groups are radically distinct from one another, and so too differed their influences upon the Greeks, whose vision of Egypt would radically shape our own. So, like, for example, the Great Pyramids. Ever wonder why these things have Greek names? Well, it's because Greek travelers went to Egypt, looked to the horizon, and laughed with one another, saying, "Hey, look, giant pyramidos." These were a type of Greek honey cakes, like baklava. So yeah, the word pyramid means honey cake. And I have no idea what the Egyptians called their great monuments. That's just one of the many examples as to how our knowledge of Egypt is heavily tinted by Greek lenses. I should probably mention here too in passing, Egyptian is a term the Greeks gave to the folks living around the Nile. The people living there called themselves the people of Kem, or Chemesians. This means people of the Black Land, which could be a reference either to Africa in general, or to the fertile black soil that flanks the Nile. So, this is a series that I'm giving loosely based around the theme of Hermeticism. So we really shouldn't talk about anything without talking about Egypt in more detail. If we can call Hermeticism a religion, which it's not, since it's more of a syncretic philosophy, then ultimately it's a religion born out of a fusion of Greek, Egyptian, Babylonian, and Hebraic concepts. Hermes Trismegistus was a Hellenistic, that is to say, an Alexandrian Greek, representation of the syncretic combination of the Greek god Hermes, a swift mediator god, on account of his being the closest planet to the sun, with the smallest orbit, and the Egyptian god Thoth, or Tehute, the ibis-headed scribe god. One of the reasons we have to believe that this fusion took place is because the two gods were worshipped as one in what had been the temple of Thoth in Chemnu, which the Greeks called Hermopolis. So Thoth and Hermes were both gods of scribecraft or communication, of theurgy, which is a fancy word for demonic magic, of astrology, and of alchemy. In addition, both gods were psychopomps, that is, the guide of the soul in the afterlife. The corpus hermeticum, which wouldn't take full form until the 3rd century AD, would bring a Greek Neoplatonic flavor to the Egyptian interest in conjuring planetary spirits and animating images or statues in a Greco-Babylonian style. The Asclepius and the Corpus Hermeticum are the most important extant writings pseudepigraphically attributed to Hermes. During the Italian Renaissance, it was generally accepted in Europe that Hermes Trismegistus had been a contemporary of Moses, but the good philologist Isaac Casaubon, in his De Rebus Sacris et Ecclesiasticis Exercitationes, written in 1614, dated the Hermetic writings to no earlier than the 2nd or 3rd century AD, which meant that they were certainly not written in remote antiquity by a godlike Egyptian priest, as the folks of the Renaissance had long believed, but by various unknown authors, all Greeks most likely, since they contain elements of popular Greek philosophies like Platonism and Stoicism, in addition to Jewish and Persian influences, which couldn't go back into antiquity further than the 5th or 6th centuries BC. The Persians weren't even around before this time. So yeah, this is why we've been so keen to cover the empires of the Eastern Mediterranean in so much detail, and why we're going to talk about the Greeks in Egypt. So let's go back for a few minutes to the middle of the 8th century BC, that is, the 700s, and then we'll go from there. Now, just before getting into that, I want to mention that the only part of Egyptian and Greek relationships in the Bronze Age that have any relevance to what we're going to talk about here is their end. The Mycenaean Greeks set the pattern for later Greek settlements and colonization in the Near East, whereas in Egypt, the character of Mycenaean contact was fairly different. There's Mycenaean and Minoan vases found as far as Thebes throughout the later portions of the Bronze Age, but these really only represent trade, not colonization. Though obviously Greek traders would have set up shop and become temporary residents in the country to trade their goods, it was the sea people who broke apart the entire Eastern Mediterranean Bronze Age system, most of whom were probably Greeks, and they were essentially kept away from Egypt, albeit with some difficulty. But this period also marked the beginning of the Nilotic civilization's decline following its brilliant New Kingdom dynasties. Much like Greece experienced a sort of quote-unquote dark age, it was not until the late 8th century that the course of Egyptian history starts to affect more than just its local population. This is where the kingdom of Nubia, which had been flourishing to the south, began to rear its head. Okay, so Nubia is a relatively modern term. The name Nubia has a contested origin. It may originate with an ancient Egyptian noun, nebu, which means gold. And another etymological interpretation claims that it originates with the name of a specific group of people called the Nubi, who lived in that area, which would become known as Nubia. So, the Egyptians referred to the south, basically what we call the Sudan today, as Kush. This is also the name used for Nubia in the Bible. Kush. The earliest history of ancient Nubia comes from the Paleolithic era, and this stretches back some 300,000 years. By around 6,000 BC, the Nubians had developed an agricultural economy which had millennia of both peaceful contact and not so peaceful contact with Egypt. The Nubians began using a system of writing relatively late in their history, and that's when they adopted the Egyptian hieroglyphic system. And the Egyptians had a sort of love-hate relationship with one another. Why? Well, it was because Nubia was Egypt's chief source of gold, and we all know how much the Egyptians loved to make use of gold for everything from amulets to plaques to death masks to idols and so forth. So, on the other hand, in basically every textual reference to the Kushites, the Egyptians referred to them as the quote-unquote vile Kushites. Now, the Egyptians were always a relatively insular and inward-looking society, so really all foreigners were vile to them. But for 1,000 years prior to this period we're talking about, the Nubians had been under the thumb of the Egyptians. Nubia was divvied up into tribes, much as many parts of Africa are still today, and lots of these tribes were constantly at war with each other. This lack of unification meant that Egypt always had the upper hand over them. Now, in this period, Egypt was having all sorts of problems in the north, dealing with various invasions and conflicts in the Near East, and the Nubians thus were allowed to grow independent. Over time, the Nubians adopted the Egyptian culture. The Egyptians had long been building temples to Amun in the south. Remember, we call this Upper Egypt because the Nile flows from the south toward the Mediterranean basin in the north. Eventually, as a result of the general pagan practice of syncretism, the Nubians came to worship the Egyptian gods. It was very fashionable to worship the gods of Egypt in addition to local deities. It was a thing of high status. This is that love-hate relationship the Nubians and the Egyptians had. It's really just a facet of the law of core periphery dynamics at work. Now, all in good time, we're going to see a Nubian king lead a campaign northward, which will actually unify Egypt from the outside in. Remember that ever since the collapse of the Bronze Age, Egypt was mostly in the twilight of its former glory, even despite having successfully fended off the attacks of the so-called Sea Peoples. Now, just an aside to put a perspective on things, Cleopatra, the famous Ptolemaic queen who had love affairs with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. She was actually alive closer to our time than she was to the building of the pyramids. Egypt is like mind-bogglingly old. Now, the name of this king who unifies Egypt was Piye, or sometimes called Pianki. I'll use these names interchangeably. Piye ruled over Nubia from Napata, which is far south. It's just above the fourth cataract of the Nile. He united the Nubians for the first time, while the Egyptians in the north were divided. The Nubians were famous for their skills in archery. They were magnificent bowmen. Nubia was even called the land of the bow at times. So, Piye marched north, and on his way, he stopped at Thebes, which was the religious center of Egypt. There, he celebrated the great Egyptian Opet festival, which was the most important religious festival at the time, when the statues of the so-called Theban triad, Amun, who was father sun, Mut, who is mother earth, and their child Khonsu, who was the moon. These three gods were escorted around in a joyous procession on a sacred bark, and they were taken from the temple of Amun in Karnak to the temple of Luxor. The highlight of the ritual was the meeting of Amun-Re of Karnak with the Amun of Luxor. This is one of those great sacred marriage rituals which were all the rage in the Eastern Mediterranean. So, in any case, Piye, a Nubian, celebrates this festival at Thebes, then continues his journey northward to fight a loose confederation of Egyptian kings. There were about 4 centers from which men were claiming legitimate rule over Egypt at this point. So, Piye crushes these 4 kings, then goes back to Nubia, and there he erects a victory stele. This is like a piece of royal propaganda. On it, he's got one of these Egyptian kings bowing down to him, and he sets up his own folks, his family and such, in high positions of power throughout Egypt. So, for example, he makes his sister high priestess at Karnak, which is an extremely important cult site in Egypt, which blows my mind every time I think about that temple there. So by doing this, he keeps the priesthood's wealth, power, and influence in his family. Now here's the weird thing. Since Piye is ruling from Napata in Nubia, he actually lets the petty princes he conquered keep their respective areas. He left them in power in order to maintain stability. When Piye died, he was actually buried in a pyramid. This is a throwback to the Old Kingdom, even though the Nubian pyramids look quite different from the Old Kingdom pyramids. They have much smaller bases and steeper inclines. But in any case, after Piye's death, Shabaka, his brother, takes over. This is a tradition in Nubia. Shabaka's dates are 721 to 707 BC. In the British Royal Museum today, you can find the Shabaka stone, which one can easily make the argument for that this is the first major document we have espousing an Egyptian philosophy. That is, this is not religion, this is philosophy. It begins like this. Shabaka says, "I have found the writings of the ancients damaged." So, Here's your appeal to antiquity. And I restored it better than it was. The stone then gives us a creation myth. And interestingly enough, it's very similar to biblical language. So, the chief god of Memphis for centuries had been the creator god Ptah. And in this Shabaka stone, Ptah thinks of the world, that is, he has a mental image of it, and then he puts it on his tongue, and it came into being. This is like the word, or the logos, made flesh. Kepher, Xepher in the English transliteration. This is a good occult word that means coming into being. In any case, you can look more into this stone if you're interested. So, as time passes, we're now moving into Sennacherib of Assyria's period. We talked about him in lectures past. In Nubian Egypt, we've got Taharqa ruling, and during Taharqa's reign, there was plenty of conflict with the Assyrian Empire. But it was also a relatively prosperous period in Egypt and in Kush. So when Taharqa was about 20, he participated in a battle with Sennacherib at Eltekeh. Now, we're going to connect some dots between our disparate stories here, and I'll tell you how. And I'll tell you how, at Hezekiah's request, Taharqa and his Egyptian/Kushite army managed to stall the Assyrian advance on Jerusalem. It was because of Taharqa that Sennacherib abandoned the siege of Jerusalem and returned home. So we can say with 100% certainty that Taharqa saved Jerusalem and Hebrew society from total destruction. And thus, this was a pivotal point in the world and Hebrew history, which is seldom remembered. Who knows what the world would look like today without the intervention of this Nubian pharaoh? We've got corroborating sources for this event in the Bible and in Herodotus. Sennacherib goes back to Assyria. There he's assassinated, and that's neither here nor there. We've talked about this before. Sennacherib's son, however, returns to fight Taharqa at Ashkelon in revenge. The empire always strikes back. And Taharqa loses. He flees south to Napata in Nubia. And then Sennacherib's son gets assassinated too. Remember, a life of power is just as nasty, brutish, and short as a life in the state of nature. There is a healthy middle ground. Ashurbanipal was the successor, and he eventually comes to the Black Land and kills all of its ruling elites in order to quell a rebellion in Egypt. Well, he killed them all except one very special aristocrat named Necho the First, who the Assyrian king then sets up as his vassal over Egypt. Before Taharqa's invasion of Egypt from the south, Necho had become ruler of Sais in 672 BC, and he assumed the title of pharaoh. A year later, the Assyrians led by Esarhaddon invaded Egypt. Necho had become one of Esarhaddon's vassals. Esarhaddon had confirmed Necho's office and his possessions. I'm sorry if all of this seems very confusing, We've got a lot of swapping back and forth of power going on. But this is going to be Egypt's fate for the rest of its days until now. I'm not going to try to give you a dry rundown of what goes on from this point onwards. What's important to know is that Egypt is basically being pulled apart by foreign powers to the north and to the south. And ultimately, after Necho's death, his son Psamtik, or Psametikos, that's what the Greeks called him, managed both to unite all of Egypt and free it from the Assyrian control within the first 10 years of his reign. This marks the end of the 25th dynasty from Nubia and the beginning of the 26th dynasty from the local Egyptian city of Sais. We call this 26th dynasty the Saite Dynasty, and this would be the last dynasty to rule before the Persian period. So now we're going to turn to how the Greeks figure in all of this, because they would come to alter the course of Egyptian history dramatically from this point onward, especially under the pharaohs Apries and Amasis. This leads us to talk about the Greek colony of Naucratis in Egypt. So, the Greek trading colony of Naucratis was situated in the Canopic branch of the Nile Delta. It was established by Ionian Milesians during the reign of the pharaoh Psamtik I, whose dates are 664 to 610. And according to Herodotus, if you want to look it up, it's book 2, 178 to 179, King Amasis of Egypt would grant the city autonomy, which officially made it the sole Greek polis in Egypt, with a trade monopoly over the whole region. Naucratis was home both to Egyptian and Greek neighborhoods. Ironically, intermarriage between Greeks and Egyptians was prohibited at Naucratis, while no such laws existed anywhere else in Egypt. In ancient Egypt, exploration was promoted primarily by imperialist and expansionist motives of the pharaohs. Between the reigns of the 3rd dynasty, ending around 2600 BC, and the 18th dynasty, ending around 1304 BC, the Egyptian pharaohs had pressed their southern frontier deep into Ethiopia and Nubia, and westward expansion had been contained by the Sahara Desert, despite being far less expansive as it is today. The camel hadn't yet been introduced into Egypt, and there was little incentive for overland traders to set out in perilous expeditions across the desert. Gold, slaves, and ivory were brought in by sea, chiefly from West Africa and the region surrounding Upper Egypt. Travel by ship up the Nile endured for centuries as the only means of opening up new trade networks. During the Mycenaean period, Egyptian explorers, soldiers, and intellectuals brought back plenty of tales of their travels from the Upper Nile, which inevitably reached the ears of Greek traders in the Delta region, up in the north. Okay, so how did Naucratis get there? In the first millennium BC, Egypt waned to such a degree that there was no longer really any centralized government overseeing both the upper and the lower kingdoms. These fractioned into numerous independent states that we just talked about, and that opened them up to foreign invasion. In Upper Egypt, the Nubian kingdom of Kush regarded itself as the true heir to the civilization of the pharaohs, but in 661, again, like we discussed, the Kushites were driven out of Egypt by the Assyrian Ashurbanipal, who established Psamtik I as governor. Psamtik persuaded the Assyrian king that it would be to his advantage to have a native Egyptian ruler over all of Egypt. Not surprisingly, Ashurbanipal didn't want to allow him such a powerful position. That's just asking for a rebellion. And with the assistance of the Lydian and Carian mercenaries, these are Greeks, and their new methods of fighting in armored phalanxes, Psamtik made himself recognized as sole ruler of Egypt by force in 664, up until his death in 610. The Lydian king Gyges, his dates are 687 to 652, who controlled large portions of Asia Minor, particularly the Greek coastal cities, set his attention toward Egypt and forged an alliance with Psamtik. Gyges provided thousands of Greek mercenaries, and in exchange for their success, Psamtik offered the Greeks 2 large plots of land straddling the canopic branch of the Nile. So this is where they established Naucratis. So despite the general estrangement between Egyptians and Greeks, the mercenaries and their families settled there at Naucratis. This sets up the scene for the pharaoh Apries, whose dates are 589 to 570. Apries launched an expedition to support the Libyan tribes against the Greeks settled in Cyrenaica. This is in northern Libya, on the coast. During this campaign, Apries sent an exclusively Egyptian army, leaving the Greek mercenaries behind. Now, the Egyptians were massacred by the Cyrenaican Greeks, and concerns over the favoring of mercenaries over local Egyptians degenerated into civil war between nationalist forces of Egyptians and Greeks settled at Naucratis. So the future pharaoh Amasis, his dates are 570 to 526, was sent by Apries to settle this crisis. In turn, Amasis took the side of the Egyptians and forced Apries out of power and into exile to Babylon. This is at the same time that the Hebrew people are in their Babylonian exile. So despite years of conflict with his neighbors, Apries joins forces with Babylon and returns to Egypt only to fight and be defeated by a force of 30,000 Carians and Ionians. 30,000 Greeks in Egypt. So, the town of Naucratis was comprised of 2 separate districts. There was one for Greeks and one for Egyptians. It was through Naucratis alone that Greeks bought Egyptian wheat, papyrus, and linens, and then exchanged them for ceramics, olive oil, silver, and wine, all commodities prized by the Egyptian nobility. The city was also well known for its production of iron. Ultimately, Egyptian and Persian rulers would impose many tariffs on the imports and exports of this trade city. Death and taxes are the only 2 constants in the civilized world, and according to Herodotus, the fortified sanctuary of the city was known as the Hellenion. Its construction was cooperatively financed by the 9 Greek city-states of Asia Minor, as they were direct beneficiaries of the trade system established at Naucratis. With the eventual arrival of Alexander the Great, Naucratis was officially declared an independent city-state, and then under Ptolemaic rule, the foundation of Alexandria at the mouth of the Canopic branch came to overshadow Naucratis' importance as a commercial center. So let's take a couple minutes to talk about the archaeology at Naucratis. It was first excavated by the great Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie in 1884 to 1885. The site at Naucratis was uncovered as one of the best sources for beautifully synthesized Greco-Egyptian art. But it's also been a precious source for the earliest Greek pottery inscriptions, including some of the early alphabets of Corinth, Milos, and Lesbos. Petrie was then followed by Ernest A. Gardner and David G. Hogarth in 1899 and 1903. So the city was divided into northern and southern districts. Unfortunately, the northern sanctuary remains submerged underwater by a 15-meter deep lake, making any further work far more difficult and expensive than the work that's already been done. There's also been a lot of destruction caused by the local populace's farming practices, and this has also wiped out the eastern part of the site. When you till land and fertilize it, you disrupt the stratigraphy of a site, and this totally disrupts the archaeologist's craft. Finds are usually quite useless when they're ex situ, out of their position in time and space, in the ground. So Petrie first excavated a large Egyptian storehouse, which he erroneously titled the Great Temenos. In the north of the remaining section, archaeologists uncovered a Greek temple to Aphrodite, and this had surprisingly not been mentioned by Herodotus. To the east of that temple, there was a ceramic workshop where many scarabs were recovered, and in 1899, the ruins of many temples were found, including one dedicated to Hera and another to Apollo, which is undoubtedly that which Herodotus referred to as the Hellenion, not the storehouse. Okay, so what's the point of talking about Naucratis? The Greeks of Naucratis were a powerful influence in the wider Hellenic world by re-exposing Greece to Egyptian architecture and sculpture that hadn't been seen since the collapse of the Bronze Age. The trade of Egyptian artifacts was re-established thanks to the trade routes of Naucratis and the Greeks of Ionia. And most importantly, for our purposes, Naucratis opened up Egypt to receiving influence from Greece, as opposed to vice versa. And this would have massive ramifications on Egypt's history from here on out, whether for better or for worse. Now, long before John of Patmos jotted down his mystical visions in what today we call the Book of Revelations, or the Apocalypse in the Bible, both of these titles mean the exact same thing, an unknown Hellenistic Egyptian wrote down a lament, which some have entitled the Apocalypse, for it, quote-unquote, prophesies the demise of Egyptian religion. This text is contained in the Asclepius, which is sometimes not treated as part of the Corpus Hermeticum, because its Greek text was lost and it was only partly preserved in Latin. So this text, that we call today the Lament of Hermes, predicted that there will come a time when it will be seen that in vain have the Egyptians honored the divinity with a pious mind and with assiduous service. All their holy worship will become inefficacious. It predicted the end of the world, the Egyptian world, a world which had endured for over 3,000 years. So I will leave you with a reading of this lament. Think about it. Mull over the loss of the Egyptian spirit with all its magical grandeur, which had endured for so long. As we press on through the years, we will see the Egyptian world disintegrate. We'll see it disintegrate from within as from without. From the machinations of ambitious foreign leaders, from the iconoclasms of fanatical priests with alien ideas, and from the destruction of timeless knowledge. So, here it is. O Egypt, Egypt, of thy religion nothing will remain but an empty tale, which thine own children in time to come will not believe. Nothing will be left but graven words, and only the stones will tell of thy piety. And in that day men will be weary of life, and they will cease to think the universe worthy of reverent wonder and worship. They will no longer love this world around us. This incomparable work of God, this glorious structure which he has built, this sum of good made up of things of many diverse forms, this instrument whereby the will of God operates in that which he has made, ungrudgingly favoring man's welfare, this combination and accumulation of all the manifold things that can call forth the veneration, praise, and love of the beholder. Darkness will be preferred to light, and death will be thought of more profitable than life. No one will raise his eyes to heaven. The pious will be deemed insane, and the impious wise. The madman will be thought a brave man, and the wicked will be esteemed as good. As for the soul and the belief that it is immortal by nature, or may hope to attain to immortality, as I have taught you, all this they will mock, and even persuade themselves that it is false. No word of reverence or piety, no utterance worthy of heaven and of the gods of heaven will be heard or believed. And so the gods will depart from mankind, a grievous thing, and only evil angels will remain, who will mingle with men and drive the poor wretches into all manner of reckless crime, into wars and robberies and frauds and all things hostile to the nature of the soul. Then will the earth no longer stand unshaken, and the sea will bear no ships. Heaven will not support the stars in their orbits. All voices of the gods will, of necessity, be silenced and dumb. The fruits of the earth will rot, the soil will turn barren, and the very air will sicken in the sullen stagnation. All things will be disordered and awry. All good will disappear. But when all this has befallen, Asclepius, then God, the creator of all things, will look on that which has come to pass, and will stay the disorder by the counterworking of his will, which is the good. He will call back to the right path those who have gone astray. He will cleanse the world of evil, washing it away with floods, burning it out with the fiercest fire, and expelling it by war and pestilence. And thus he will bring back his world to its former aspect, so that the cosmos will once more be deemed worthy of worship and wondering reverence. And God, the maker and maintainer of the mighty fabric, will be adored by the men of that day with continuous song of praise and blessing. Such is the new birth of the cosmos. It is a making again of all things good, a holy and awe-striking restoration of all nature, and it is wrought inside the process of time by the eternal will of the Creator. Now, there's plenty of ways we can interpret this. We can interpret it in the light of Christianity and the destruction of traditional Egyptian religion, if we can even say there was such a monolithic thing. Pardon the pun. We can think of things like the burning of Alexandria's library, both at the hands of Julius Caesar's armies in the middle of the 1st century BC, or much later when Egypt's majority Christian population persuaded local rulers to raise the Serapeum, that great repository of ancient quote-unquote pagan scholarship. We could also interpret this lament in light of the coming of Islam, which would designate all of Egypt's pharaonic past as Jahiliyyah, an age of ignorance from divine guidance, a disparaging view of that glorious empire which is still clung to in more conservative and radical sects of Islam. But, like all prophecies, I think we should look to the time when this lament was written. Prophecies, though staged in the future, are typically warnings about the way things are going now. Now, as in the 2nd or 3rd centuries AD. We've not come to this period yet, but we'll get there eventually. So, for now, this is Dan Uttrell signing off, and you've been listening to the Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History. I'll see you next week.
Above, or with a conscious, separate understanding of the creative process. It then incarnated, according to the ancients, in the sun itself, and began the great evolutionary part of its existence. Having gathered all its resources to achieve birth, it now achieved maturity of embodiment by gradually releasing these resources into the vacuum that had been left by the retirement of energy in the first place. It therefore began to fill the privation around it with energy which had passed through and been conditioned by its own consciousness. And from this came the orbits and bodies of the planets, as we know them, to become the embodiments of the 7 loci, or the 7 bowels, or the 7 Elohim of the first chapter of Genesis, who moved upon the face of the deep. Having gradually built all of this structure into a consistent pattern, we find the solar logos gradually achieving maturity, producing what we might term today a structure in which the consciousness of the solar deity became permeated throughout the entire area. of manifestation. When they are not embodied, they are not in manifestation. So man gains the power to perfect himself in arts and crafts and skills through the process of embodiment. And through this process he learns the particular lesson of the great solar field of which he is a part. For the solar power itself has impressed a purpose upon the entire proceeding.